Hello and good morning, everyone, and welcome to your morning briefing for Friday, the 9th of May, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shelby. Happy Friday to everyone. Let's go ahead and jump inside the Beltway here. Or excuse me. We will start off with an update here on India-Pakistan. Jared, good morning.
Good morning. So a couple quick updates. The Indians are now reporting that fighting has expanded all along the western border. So pursuant to that, I've erased the individual strikes and now just assume that wherever the green and orange touch, they're fighting. Both sides have confirmed aircraft losses. The exact number of Indian losses seems up for debate, but both are saying, yes, we are losing aircraft. The Pakistani side is claiming to have disabled an Indian airfield in Jammu. I saw what they're claiming to have commercial satellite confirmation of it, where they have several large holes in the main runway that would actually disable it. And the final bit of the update, which is good news for Americans, the vice president has said this is not our business, has nothing to do with our ability to control it. We're generally going to stay out of this.
Mm-hmm. All right. Hey, I see on the slide, it says Pakistan lost 2 JF-17s. Are those Chinese made? What is the JF-17?
The JF-17s are Chinese made. Most of Pakistan's jets are Chinese made.
Okay. I seem to recall, didn't the Biden administration, I'm pretty sure it was a $400 million deal for F-16s. I don't know what the delivery date on that was, but I could have sworn that we were sending F-16s to Pakistan.
I will double check on the F-16s. I think they do run those. They definitely run F-15s. We had those in our order of battle for them.
Maybe it was 15s. Okay.
That was back in the Obama administration that I was having to know those. So they've known that for a while. But they are largely buying Chinese aircraft at this point, and their attendant missiles as well.
Okay. All right. Interesting. And just as a reminder, Pakistan is a client state of China. All right. Jared, thanks for staying on top of this. There's still a lot of concern that this thing may go nuclear. I doubt that it does, but maybe we haven't seen the worst of it yet. Jared, thanks for staying on top of this. And if you have any major breaking updates, you'll push that out through the app. By the way, now's a great time to join us over on the high side. You can do that. Start a free 7-day trial at www.earlywarningnetwork.com. Join the community. Good updates throughout the day. Let's go ahead and move on. All right. So President Trump yesterday announced this trade deal with the UK. A lot of people were expecting that India would be the first major trade deal announced. That was probably derailed by this war. However, I think the UK is a really good runner-up. And President Trump said several trade deals are going to be announced over the next couple of weeks. They've been saying that for two plus weeks now, I think. But under this trade deal, the United Kingdom is going to, quote, reduce or eliminate non-tariff trade barriers to the U.S., and the U.S. is going to fast-track $5 billion worth of American exports, like chemicals, machinery, and other industrial goods that were previously barred by the UK. On this phone call yesterday between British Prime Minister Starmer and President Trump, they said the Biden administration has been working on this trade deal for a long time, and it's been a long time coming. And, of course, Trump in his normal way said, Biden couldn't get it done, but I could. And actually, I do think this is pretty important. President Trump said, quote, both countries have agreed that economic security is national security, and we'll be working together as allies to ensure that we have a strong industrial base. Now, we've previously covered the Trump administration really looks like they're trying to build a tariff wall among U.S. trade partners against China, trying to get through these trade deal negotiations, trying to get these foreign countries to impose their own tariffs against China. I think we could probably call this somewhat of a maximum pressure campaign, economic pressure against China. Not only is the goal to prevent transshipment of Chinese goods to the U.S., but also to induce more economic pressure on China. The current 145% tariff rate, first of all, it's not equally applied. There's a lot of carve-outs. As a matter of fact, Ken Griffin, who is previously on and off again supported President Trump, but has most recently, he said he voted for him, but didn't really support him. Ken Griffin is a founder of the hedge fund Citadel. He's a billionaire. And he said he said the tariffs were crony capitalism because the Trump administration is basically able to go in and pick which industries or which goods they want tariffed and which ones they don't. Apple pretty famously was excluded from these 145% tariffs. At any rate, I don't think this is, President Trump says, oh, this is going to produce so much money for the US government. And I don't actually think that's the real case. I think the real case is try to get Americans to stop or substantially curb their buying of Chinese goods. And I say that because last month, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said that China was trying to export their way out of a painful recession. And he said, quote, we can't let them do that. So this is very clearly economic containment. Now, as for this specific trade deal, it so far does not include British tariffs on China. Last year, the Brits said we're not going to put tariffs on China, broadly at least. But it does increase industrial cooperation between the United States and the UK, both of which are trying to rebuild their militaries. Now, earlier this year, you may recall, the British government ended up nationalizing British Steel after its Chinese owners attempted to shut down the last remaining 2 blast furnaces in the country. British Steel will now have a U.S. market for steel exports. As of last year, the trade numbers, I think the U.S. gets about 2% of its steel from China. And so this British steel will maybe at least partially replace the U.S. imports of Chinese steel. The British will also be able to export Rolls-Royce aircraft engines to Boeing and then turn around and purchase $10 billion in Boeing aircraft. Both Trump and British Prime Minister Starmer said this would protect workers on both sides. The last thing I'll say about this is, as you can see in the image below, what special relationship between the U.S. and the UK. Britain is struggling to accept the end of Atlanticism, the limits of the UK-US special relationship, and now is the time for a bold new UK-EU relationship. Last month, we were told this is the end of the special relationship. It no longer exists. The UK needs to turn away from the United States and build big, beautiful trade deals with the EU instead. There was so much doubt cast on this special relationship last month, and this trade deal was announced on the 80th anniversary of the Allied victory in Europe Day. British Prime Minister Starmer, who has been a noted critic of Trump, said that the two countries would remain, quote, absolutely the closest of allies. And this was just simply not a message that we were previously seeing. So I think this is not the end of Atlanticism. And I think it probably also shows the EU what's possible. Really what the Trump administration is trying to do, they're trying to get all these countries to commit to being in the U.S. sphere of influence. And I think trade is one good way to do that. Let's move on. DHS Secretary Kristi Noem was in front of Congress yesterday, and Democrats accused her of mismanaging the DHS budget. Senator Chris Murphy said, quote, your agency will be broke by July, over 2 months before the end of the fiscal year. Now, Noem said that DHS had suspended some programs, but they did that in order to divert funding towards deportation and immigration enforcement. And she added that the budget shortfall reflects that reality of just how much money it costs to deport these people and enforce immigration laws. Noem later told reporters that DHS will remain solvent. I'm not entirely sure that it will, but she said that DHS will remain solvent, even if the requested $175 billion of additional funding is not approved through this reconciliation process. She's pretty much depending on this reconciliation bill to go through so that DHS can get more money. Noem also told Congress that, quote, there's no scenario where Kilmar Abrego Garcia would be returned to the United States. She said, if he were to come back, we would immediately deport him again. This seems to me that DHS really is unlikely to continue normal operations without any additional funding through reconciliation. It actually does appear like DHS will run out of money and have to continue curbing some programs. That was one of the areas where Senator Chris Murphy criticized Noem, and she did admit that some DHS programs have been halted. So this is something we'll keep an eye on. But, one of the things that Democrats said is because a lot of this money has been shifted to immigration enforcement, apparently maybe some national security programs under DHS that are not getting the funding or the resources they need. And so this could be substantial. Let's move on here to the next item. We got some roll-ups. Jared, good morning. Let's start with this farm bill, which has lapsed. And what's the latest here?
Sorry, let me unmute myself real quick. So funding under the 5-year farm bill for key programs including citrus pests and feral hogs that destroy at least $2.5 billion in crops has lapsed since December 2024. House Republicans are working on the farm bill, and they said that they are uncertain that Congress can pass a full bill by the 30 September deadline. And Robert had a comment on this, saying that House Republicans are attempting to work some key farm bill programs into the budget reconciliation bill. However, Republican focus on the budget bill and must pass spending bills ahead of the 30 September deadline could prevent the passage of a full farm bill. And the key pest control programs could remain unfunded, increasing crop damages while the U.S. ag industry is facing higher input costs and fallout from the U.S.-China trade war.
Mm-hmm. All right.
And we do have a bit of an update for the U.S. drought monitor from earlier this week. There's significant drought down in the Southwest, and it looks like Florida is also experiencing a bit of a drought.
Yeah, the University of Nebraska at Lincoln produces this drought monitor. It comes out every Thursday. We'll start putting these in every Friday reports, every Friday's report with an update on the latest here. I included this map in this week's report because this U.S.-Mexico water trade treaty has been a sticking point in U.S.-Mexico relations. Mexico is not giving the United States the water that it is required to under this treaty. Probably one reason is because they don't have the water themselves, or they don't have enough water. So this could be this could develop into a situation there for the Southwest, especially Southwest Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Southern California. I think let's move on, Jared.
All right. So the State Department sanctioned a third Chinese teapot oil refinery in northeast China for facilitating the delivery of hundreds of millions of dollars worth of Iranian oil. We've covered this a few different times. This is part of an ongoing effort to really stymie China's ability to develop a strategic petroleum reserve. But a lot of this is disrupting the flow of oil as well. And a teapot refinery is just a small capacity private refinery as opposed to a state refinery in China. Mm-hmm. And Japanese media reported that there was an enormous increase in international diplomacy heading to Taiwan. There was a 33% increase between the U.S., UK, and Japanese diplomatic missions heading to Taiwan between 2022 and the end of 2024. It was went from 300 missions to 400 missions inside of a year. The U.S. reportedly saw about a 37.5% increase during that time, and at the same time, the U.S. increased its personnel in the American Institute in Taiwan, which is an unofficial embassy, to over 550 personnel. And the reason this matters is that China really has very little room to actually respond to this due to all their other actions. So they're likely going to diplomatically protest, for what that's worth at this point, and maintain gray zone warfare tactics, increase drills, all of that. But I think the big thing here is if China were to attempt to blockade Taiwan, we're now looking at almost 600 U.S. personnel that are just diplomats on the island, never mind anybody else that could also be there.
So is this something, Jared, just in terms of early warning indicators, if the State Department begins reducing their diplomatic staff in Taipei and wherever else on the island, is that a good sign of maybe what's to come?
I think so. If we see a sudden exodus, then it would likely indicate they believe that an attack is imminent. That said, if you want, if you need a reason to be involved and you don't think people are going to say, well, yeah, Taiwan's a matter of national security, having 600 diplomats on the island potentially being treated as hostages would actually be a very good way to go, okay, we need to get in there and get them. We need to run this blockade to get them.
Mm-hmm. All right, and let's move on to Germany. Give us the bottom line here.
Bottom line is Germany, the number 2 power inside of Europe, is starting to match American interests. He's cutting ESG, mirroring what the Trump
German
administration.
chancellor.
Yes,
Okay.
he's cutting ESG requirements on supply chain so we can reindustrialize, which is something that the American diplomats have asked Europe to do. And he's going, instead of doing tit for tat tariffs, he's coming to negotiate and try to push for a zero tariff between the U.S. and Germany.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. All right. Thanks for that. Let's move on here to some other domestic items. This study was published in Nature, and it was a peer-reviewed study showing that major U.S. cities continue sinking, or parts of those cities continue sinking, due to underlying geological conditions and also overpumping of groundwater. So too much groundwater extraction and other factors. The study showed that at least 20% of each city examined here shows measurable sinking. Texas cities, Houston, Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex top the list there. Over 29,000 buildings in Texas alone are classified as high or very high structural risk due to parts of the ground shifting underneath them. Now, to put this into context, I saw a lot of this on environmentalist websites. And, of course, the important details are buried down in the bottom. But to put this into the context, parts of Houston are sinking, and Houston tops the list here. It's the worst. Sinking by 5 millimeters per year. That's about 2 inches per decade. So this is not something that is imminently catastrophic, but over time, it does pose substantial long-term risks to buildings and infrastructure in these areas. Water demand, well, I'll tell you right now, just in the Texas Triangle between Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, Austin, San Antonio, there's so many people moving here that water demand is actually increasing. There is a risk of overpumping our aquifer. And I was doing a custom area study for a guy, and I was looking into the underlying aquifer. Where he lives, they said there's like 2 decades left of water in that aquifer. And these things often take decades to centuries to recharge, years at best to recharge. You don't recharge them during a drought. So this is going to becoming a more and more, just to population increase water demand, overpumping of these aquifers. This is becoming a huge deal for much of the United States, and we're seeing that here. Probably the worst of it here in Texas. All right, let's move on. All right, Jared. Israel, they're saying what they have to prepare to defend themselves without American support.
Yes, and that's coming from the Israeli Minister of Defense. He's saying we can no longer rely on American support. We have to prepare to defend ourselves, which is a wild to hear. And this is in response to the Israeli government being, by all reports, entirely unaware that the U.S. and Yemen were preparing a ceasefire in the Red Sea. And in addition to that, U.S. Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee had a few things to say about it. He said when questioned on, hey, why didn't you tell us? He said the U.S. is not required to get permission from Israel to make some type of arrangement that would get the Houthis from firing on our ships, which, being that Mike Huckabee's generally known to be pro-Israel, that's quite the statement. And at the same time, Israeli media is extremely, or claims that Israel is concerned President Trump is going to announce an Iran nuclear deal that leaves the nuclear program intact. Israel wants a total denuclearization, no energy, none of it. And they're afraid that there's going to be a nuclear energy program. And they think that this will leave Israel isolated. On the same note, Israel's main negotiators in the region reported, this is coming from Israeli media, they said that they have completely failed to influence foreign policy or even keep abreast of secret talks. So that would be, spying on us. At the same time, President Trump is heading to the Middle East next week with no plans to visit Israel, per Israeli media, and it has teased a big announcement that may come as soon as tonight or possibly Monday. We'll have to see, but he keeps teasing this announcement without saying what it's going to be about leading into this.
Mm-hmm. Jared, over the past month or so, few weeks, I've noticed a strange thing going on between the United States and Israel. And basically Trump, I think now there's a break in direct contact between President Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu. I just see now, just a short while ago, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth canceled his trip to Israel due to this ongoing spat. I'm looking for this exact quote right now, but there was one. I'm not even sure how real it is because I saw it online, and of course, everything you see is true online. But a reporter said, "Well, what happens if Israel gets attacked or something like that?" And President Trump said, "Well, that's kind of not my problem," which is 180 degrees opposite of what we were hearing on the campaign trail. And so, I don't know exactly what this is over. Maybe it's over Israel's plans for Gaza. I'm not sure. Do you have any idea? But the point is, there's something obvious going on here.
Yeah, I think if we just look at the sum of what Israel's done just since the administration took over, anytime the Iran deal starts coming up, you see Israel saying we're going to
deal. Yeah.
Right. You see Israel saying we're going to strike Iran. We need to push for total denuclearization, which is a red line for Iran. Every time Trump tries to get a ceasefire going between Israel and Hamas, that breaks down. Israel keeps expanding north. We've covered Hezbollah. We've covered it pretty extensively, Turkey, and I think that's actually a sincere threat because if anything kicks off there, it's a very outside scenario. But we can't forget that Turkey is a NATO ally. Mm-hmm. If Israel were to actually attack Turkey, we have to now have that talk of, okay, is this an activation of Article 5? Mm-hmm. Does the U.S. then go to war with Israel? Like, how does this all work? I think it's back. I think Trump administration is backing off because it's, okay, this is getting way too messy. You need to calm down and go sit.
It must be that. It must be that Israel's pressing for a war or expanded military operations or maybe a regional war, say, against Iran. And President Trump saying, I don't need that right now. We're still trying to extract ourselves from this Russia-Ukraine thing. We're trying to focus on China. We do not want to get embroiled in another Middle East conflict. Yeah. And not to mention the price of oil and gas prices, what would happen if Iran and Israel do get into this conflict here. Any closing thoughts here?
Yeah, I do see one question on the Turkey-Israel issue that I think is topical. Do we kick Turkey out of NATO? Absolutely not. Turkey is geographically probably the most important strategic spot for NATO's mission, which is to contain Russia. You can shut off their entire warm water fleet with Turkey involvement. You don't kick Turkey out.
All right. Thanks for that, Jared. Let's move on here to our questions for the day. Regarding the Farm Bill, has anyone had time to run the numbers on what we might be looking at in terms of loss of product due to this? That is definitely a Robert question. Robert's out this week. We'll have to circle back for you. Is a threat of a Sino-Taiwan war a way for China to rid itself of surplus men to buy a little more life for the CCP? No, I don't think so. They do have a demographic imbalance between males and females. I think it's like 1.2 or 1.3 males for every female, which doesn't sound like a lot until you calculate maybe 1 billion people. So, no, I don't think this. China has an inverted pyramid in terms of demographics. They have way too many old people and not enough young people. This is another strategic consideration for China. They cannot kill a generation or half a generation of young men in a military conflict. They don't have it. Yeah. They don't have, in terms of demographics, China does not have the cards. They have lots of people, but demographically, they do not have the cards.
Yeah, I've seen numbers as high as 35 million unmarried men as well. So that's exactly the demographic you're talking about. Could you imagine going to war and saying, yeah, we lost 35 million men, but we still won? Like that even just for the face of it, they would have to take a loss on that. They can't afford to take a loss at all.
Yeah. I don't know. I'll tell you, I think, you look at that problem that China has and you start to ask yourself, why doesn't China just export those people abroad?
They've done that somewhat, but I mean, it's still tens of millions of men that they don't have a whole lot to do with.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, who's going to live in these vacant cities if they continue exporting their population abroad, Jared? All right, next question. All right, regarding the Nature article in cities sinking, is there data on how much they've sunk and the rate of sinking? Yeah, I covered it just real briefly. It's parts of Houston are sinking at 5 millimeters per year. Does not sound like a lot. It's about 2 inches. I'm not a math major, but I think that's about 2 inches per decade. So nothing substantial. But I've been covering this stuff, the depleting aquifers, for several years now. And they say parts of the San Joaquin Valley in California have sunk by 28 feet due to overpumping during periods of prolonged drought. This is not a Texas and a California problem. This is happening in lots of places across the country. So, that stuff goes back to the Dust Bowl, I think, as well. All right, if I remember right, UK sold their steel to China. How did the UK get it back? They did. I think that was back in 2020. Some Chinese investors at the Jingwei Group or some Jing something group bought British steel. And what happened was there was this disagreement between the UK government and these Chinese investors, and about buying where they're going to get inputs for steel production. And apparently these Chinese investors wanted to buy it from China and not from British sources. And so the UK government said, well, we're not going to allow you to do that. And these Chinese investors said, well, okay, that's fine. We'll just shut down these last 2 remaining blast furnaces. And the UK said, well, we can't allow you to do that either. So in one day, British Parliament pushed through this law that nationalized British steel. So now the UK government owns British steel. So that's what happened. That's how they got it back. And the Chinese no longer own it. Is the pumping, is it the deep aquifers or closer to the surface? Well, I think it's a groundwater, and it's not only a groundwater issue, it's also a deep aquifer issue. Like if you look at parts of the Ogallala aquifer, I think environmental engineers or hydrologists or whoever expect, the latest numbers I've seen is parts of that in Kansas, I think it has like maybe 2 decades left at current rates. If they continue pumping as they are out of the aquifer, parts of that aquifer is going to go dry in the next 2 decades. Other parts I've seen years, like maybe 5 to 10 years. I think there's the Ozarks Plateau aquifer also. And I don't know how you solve that problem, but it's going to be a creeping problem, I would say.
We are all caught up.
All right. Well, everyone, that's going to do it for today's show. Thanks so much for the support. As a reminder, start a free 7-day trial over on the Early Warning Network app. We have lots of information sharing going on. The morning briefing ends, but the show goes on over there. Thousands of members sharing information. We also have state rooms as well. So if you want to break out and share information about what's going on in your state, I don't read all the conversations, but lots of good stuff coming in. And it's local information sharing, and that's what the Early Warning Network is all about: information sharing, making new connections, and not only staying ahead of what's happening on the strategic and national level, but also staying out ahead on the state and local level. With that, everyone, we hope you have a great week. We will be back in your inbox, or excuse me, a great weekend. We will be back in your inbox on Monday, back on the show at 08 Central Time. Until then, be well and stay out front.